As we move towards bringing children back to school, we must ask who was worst affected by the pandemic and why. Decoding Exclusion, an interview series by the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy, aims to discuss the various facets of the problem of exclusion in education in India. With a range of experts in the field of law, policy, and education, we examine evidence on new sites of exclusion and ways in which we can support children and their households as we bring them back to school. Welcome to Vidhi's Decoding Exclusion, an interview series where we break down the various facets of exclusion from mainstream education in India. I'm Nisha, and I lead the Inclusive Education vertical at the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy. And in today's episode, I'm in conversation with Madhukar Banuri, founder and director of Leadership for Equity, an organization that aims to create effective public education systems through building the capacity of government system leaders in partnership with local and state education bodies. In today's conversation, we discuss the range of work that LFE has been involved in, especially their focus on socio-emotional learning and how it can be scaled in India. We discuss the various pervasive problems that states face in addressing the issue of out-of-school children, including how we must reform the way we track children and the entitlements they receive from cradle to career. Most interestingly, Madhukar talks about how, contrary to popular belief, mid-level state leaders do not lack the autonomy to make decisions that can affect change. Rather, he suggests, they lack the capacity to effectively make those decisions. And this is the missing link that organizations like LFE are dedicated to. Any conversation with Madhukar is an opportunity to learn from his tremendous experience. So let's jump right into the episode.
Thanks, Nisha, for having me.
So I'll just get started with some of the questions that we've thought of. Leadership for Equity during the pandemic was doing a lot of sort of response work with sort of, meeting the needs of children. And one of the areas that I think that you all were focusing on, correct me if I'm wrong, was sort of on socio-emotional learning specifically. And I think this is something that while a lot of people were speaking about the need for that, I don't think most of us had the expertise to actually try and address that at such short notice, right? So can you tell us a little bit about this? Who were the kinds of stakeholders you were working with? And
No, thanks, Nisha, for setting the context. So I think, as you rightly said, a lot of what we did when the COVID hit, like the entire sector and like everyone together, we were all trying to figure out, right, like what is the best course of action. So I think there was a lot of hustling in terms of what needs to be done, a lot of pivoting. But I think one thing we said was, especially given our long-term focus of the organization, let's just try and focus on really what are the issues when it comes to education and not pivot completely to more relief work. So I think after the first wave, 6 to 7 months down the line, we in fact did a quick dipstick survey in December 2020. Even I think our entire team went into the communities, villages and rural and tribal parts of Maharashtra, and we tried to understand really what are the challenges, what are certain things that the state feels like these are the initiatives that we are taking, are they reaching to the ground, what are some of the issues that are happening with when it comes to education. So I think that was really an eye-opener. And I think one of the big things, of course, education was it. We all know the studies, there have been numerous studies that are published, right? So I'm not going to go into that. But I think one of the key issues wherever we went, in fact, starkingly after this we're talking about December 2020, after like a good 7-8 months of COVID hit and school closure, a huge spike in the parents reporting anxiety, in children, stress in children, a lot of, different behavioral shifts when it comes to like getting restless. Some of these aspects became big problematic for even because parents did not have the ability to have children 24/7 with them, right? And I think that really started questioning around, putting questions to the educators around what is the kind of challenges that families are facing. And that's when this whole idea of social emotional learning and needs came into picture. So I think like it took us, of course, it didn't come. There were many organizations who were talking about it for a long time, but literacy numeracy comes very naturally for education organizations and not when you think of really well-being of children, right? So I think that really, and then the question became the larger takeaway. And I think from this piece of survey that we did was whether the system in itself was ready to implement any sort of social emotional learning kind of programs or even support to the children at scale. We're not talking about like a one village or
Of
100
course.
villages. The problem of India has always been at scale. So I think how do you is the system ripe enough to be able to take that? So that was a larger sort of a question and the learning that we've had when we did this sort of dipstick survey.
Right. And sorry, what is the answer we reached on that? Are we ready? Are we able?
We were, at least in 2020, we weren't. Everyone acknowledged that there was something like this happening. But
Right.
the system, when I say system, it's about, teachers, the
Yeah.
parents accepting it, the machinery or policymakers trying to make sense that, this is also a big need apart from just saying that there is learning loss.
Right, right, absolutely. So another thing that so one is firstly this idea of the sort of doing a dipstick survey. I think that's something that a lot of organizations, as included, were maybe either unable to do or we don't always do. And I think we sometimes end up doing that, the classic thing of sort of creating not maybe creating, but sort of ideating how we want to go about things from a very top-down place, right? Even though we, at least we talk about being more ground up and this and that. But yeah, so okay, that makes a lot of sense that you were led to something maybe unique because you sort of went about it in that way. But the other thing that I think has always been quite fascinating about LFE's approach is in a sector where we see so many players focusing on the private organizations and private providers of education. And of course, during COVID, EdTech was the sort of big thing that needed to be done. LFE has always sort of taken the approach of strengthening public education, right? And through building state capacity. So why was it important for you? I mean, maybe even, since the beginning, since its inception, for you to work on this? And then specific to during COVID, how did that kind of fare? Were you able to continue that?
Yeah, no, I think great question. A lot of, for us, at least when we were starting up Leadership for Equity, the founding team, and roughly we come with from 12 to 15 years of experience in education, just having spent time within the classrooms and then working with schools and communities. A big part of our understanding, like some of the belief system really formed in those 10 to 12 years of when we were working on the ground. And I think like one of the big beliefs that we operate with even currently and that influenced us to do the work that we do is the understanding the problem of education in India. And I think we have, by, I mean, seems like a rhetoric for many people who have heard me, but I think the problem of India is not a problem of a 100,000 or a 10,000 children. It's a problem of millions, right? No matter, even if today an organization says we are working with 1 million children, the denominator is still 240. So whatever we are trying to do, if we are not able to solve it for scale, I don't think like we're moving the needle. And I think this is something that, I mean, as a teacher, I've spent my first few years in education as inside a classroom. And this thing always haunted me. Like, fine, it's great. I'm teaching a class of 30, 35 children. But what about, 700 in my school and 70,000 in my city? That's one thing that really sort of shaped the way. The second piece of it is this idea of equity. Like if you look at a meta level, really macro, what is the problem of education? There's roughly 115 million children who belong to the poorest of poor communities in India still continue to go to the government-run schools. And as a country, what we have achieved over the last 75 years after independence is basically a top 10, 20%, right? And imagine the kind of potential that is still untapped in a country like India, and where we can, when we talk about this 5 trillion economy, etc., etc. But till the time you don't tap into the bottom of the pyramid in terms of the reach of underserved, we're not doing justice. So I feel like that from an equity lens, and you don't strengthen public schools, and 800 plus governments are there in India, your district and state administrations, they are catering to these, they are supposed to deliver quality to these 115, 120 million children, which they are not able to. In some ways they're succeeding, in many ways they're not. So I feel like if you are able to place our bets on those systems to be able to serve better, I think we would have been, we will see the shifts in the way India is operating. So I feel these two beliefs really sort of pushed the basis of when we started off Leadership for Equity. And again, studying a lot of these interventions, last 2 to 3 decades, several nonprofit organizations have invested crores and crores of money into saying this is exactly the way language needs to learn, a lot of effort in pedagogy, the kind of material, and which was phenomenal, right? Like, I think it's great. But I think what we need now, if you see, the ability of the governments to be able to deliver quality at scale is limited. And you compare some of the system public, I'm not even saying education, you compare it with health, sanitation, some of the big public, basic public services that should happen. Compare it with the developed economies. Foundation of strong public systems is always a base. Let it be transportation. You pick anything, right? It's always think of your European countries or US or wherever. And I think but the ability to deliver that service relies a lot on this middle management, especially in a country like India. And those are extremely strong, sensitive, and effective in developed nations. Yeah, even to roll out simple thing like a vaccination. We know no matter how the policy is strong, till the time that last a health officer of that cluster or that block is not taking ownership to say that every adult above 60 years is going to get vaccinated in my village or cluster, it's not going to happen. The same thing is with education. Closest to the teachers and schools are your cluster officers, your block officers.
Right.
Oh, we have seen the anti-example also. Great programs are happening, but I think with a single stroke of pen, a block officer can shut the entire thing down. So these guys have access to resources. They have the agency and power to do it. And we need to sort of tap into that. But one last thing of comparing it with the corporate also, a district pick any district in India, it has an average of about 2,000 to 3,000 schools. A staff of about 8,000 to 12,000 teachers, a single district in India on an average. Put it in a corporate lens. If there were 8,000 people company, what are the kind of qualities in a CEO that you are looking at? Now, you're expecting a district education officer to play that role. So what kind of skills and sensitivity, the effectiveness and efficiency with which a DO should operate, which unfortunately isn't there. Our IAS officers in the top go to Harvards and Stanfords and Oxfords of the world, but your middle management doesn't get that kind of support. So I think that's where I think this ethos comes in and we place our bets on middle management.
Right. No, so one is in terms of, and maybe we can come back to this question about sort of what your experience has been working at these different levels of government, right? But an interesting thing that you sort of mentioned right now is that this mid-level management that plays such a crucial role, they do in some sense have a certain amount of autonomy and agency to make decisions about how education is actually rolled out. And you also mentioned that they maybe have the resources to do that as well. So this is interesting to me, maybe because I'm coming with, not enough knowledge of how it works at that level. But during COVID, we saw so much conversation around, because essentially there were these central level decisions being made that the entire country will be shut down, the Anganwadi shut down first, all the schools shut down. And even in terms of reopening schools, we largely heard it being a decision that was being made at the level of the state, right? And of course, there was some pushback. There were some districts and, in villages and stuff where people were saying, no, we can already open, or they were doing it sort of, under the radar, perhaps. And so a lot of the conversation that was happening was around, we need, our sort of middle level management, but also at the level of the district, at the level of the block, to be able to sort of make decisions about when schools can reopen and how they will deliver, whether it will be hybrid or not. But yeah, so I mean, I would be interested to sort of hear your take on that. Do we feel like we had that autonomy? Do we usually have it? How important is that?
Yeah, no, absolutely critical, right? I think because again, as I said, each district is not small in India.
Yeah.
Like with the US district, they have 15, 20, 30 schools. We multiply that by 100 is where we have our districts, right? So in fact, when schools also reopen, right, after COVID, we are coming a lot from like 3 or 4 states where we are working very closely with the administration. But I think in Maharashtra, a lot of the decision making was left to the collector. By the way, not just Maharashtra, across the country, the state said the decision to open schools lies with the collector of the district. A lot of because collector is the de facto head of the disaster management committee, so they took the decision. So I think like some of the districts opened late, faced based on the number of cases, etc. The framework was given by the state. Center didn't even have a role. I think everything was left to the state when it was opening, right?
Yeah.
So even in the districts, what we saw was those villages. So I think the owners then fell from a district to blocks to villages, saying those villages where there are no cases, like what is stopping us from opening? In fact, like we had seen, I mean, you won't believe some of the schools we have seen was throughout they were open during COVID. They never shut. They did not even shut a single day even during COVID, primarily because the local authorities, the
Mm.
local governance, because especially in a country where the gram panchayats, you have a lot of autonomy of people representation, like they were able to take a decision on their own saying that we're going to, keep them open because we feel there's no case of COVID inside the whole village. Why should we even shut it down, right? Why should the education stop? So I
Right.
think and we saw a bunch of examples around that. So I feel uh, decision making to reopen the schools, in fact, was left a lot. It was heavily decentralized and it came down to that cluster and village level. Now,
Okay.
what we also saw during COVID was a lot of communication, of course, because one, of course, nationwide shutdown was highly received and everything just went, overnight it just became toppled. But I think the what happened was a lot of communications around how best to sort of reach out to children. What are some of the activities happening with teachers and
Mm.
parents? All of that was happening at district level. Like we saw some fabulous programs being rolled out for learning support in Maharashtra. Like an example is Nagpur. In Nagpur
Mm.
division, the amazing division commissioner Sanjay ji, he basically took the lead, and whatever 4 5 districts were under him, he sort of made sure all the programs were rolled out right from the division district level to the block level, including the radio programs, materials, like some of the
Mm.
when he said that we're going to invest in print material, especially to the tribal areas where nothing was reaching. There's no
Yeah.
technology, no penetration of any mobile phone network. So they said we're going to print out and give worksheets to children. That was all done through DPDC funding, which is a district planning commission fund, which is the prerogative of which lies with the collector. They all
Yeah.
did that. So I think like the all of those decisions for rollout of programs, the way we were communications happened, what needs to be done, the COVID duty, those teachers were not just expected to do this, they were playing several other roles inside the communities. All of that happened at district level. So this middle management, where in fact they were the ones in which whatever now we think we're seeing, the ASAR results were released
Yeah.
yesterday. So I think a lot of we don't know. I mean, it's still abysmal to see the learning outcomes, but I think if these guys didn't play a role, we don't know what would have happened.
Right, right. So, my question would then be, because I think this is a little bit different from maybe some of the narrative we were hearing, at least in the initial days, where we were saying, it needs to be more decentralized. So maybe that did actually, in effect, happen. But so then, what would you say is there a need for greater support of this mid-level management so that they can make these decisions more effectively? So say even now when we're coming to the recovery, we're in that recovery period, we're trying to get children back to school. We do know a lot of them are, maybe not enrolled, even though recovery has started for a lot of age groups. So do we feel like there's a need to sort of support this mid-level management more to be able to make more effective decisions? And then how do we kind of do that?
Absolutely, and there's no question about it because the state and what center, though, I don't think has an extremely limited role to play in any of the education work that happens at a state. But even the state, a lot of the frameworks around like how to curb the learning loss, right? Like we're talking about Nipun Bharat right now, the fill-in mission that's
Yeah.
been the roles, and now I think with yesterday's results, it's become even more important for us to focus on that 3 to sort of 8 age group and the kind of learning gaps that we're talking about. And all of the protocols and the guidelines, if you see that the state is framing, at least in Maharashtra, Andhra, where we are working closely with the states, it's all saying till the time the diets, the district offices do not take lead in that, the Nipun Bharat mission is not going to be successful. But it becomes logical that we place our bets on the middle managers and strengthen them. Look at how the vaccine, because see, a great example of how India as a country, we respond to crisis was vaccination. Who could have imagined like I mean, polio took years. Yeah. Like, I mean, you talk about like 100 crore vaccinations.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been done without the numerous efforts of the grassroots workers, but we did it. I think the only thing there it was a life and death issue. Here we need to make it a life and death issue, saying that in the time children that urgency to say that we have to shut everything down, pick 6 months, make sure that children are learning on the minimum learning levels. But someone needs that. We need a lot of political capital to do it. But still, it happened. So I think it's not that we cannot do it. I think we can do it, but it has to be done at the ground level. It has to be a ground up approach till the time we don't place bets on those district officials, those block and cluster officials. None of the education reform can happen.
Right, right. So, you sort of mentioned that you worked in you work in a few different states, and LFE sort of has a presence in, I think you said 3 states, right?
That's right.
And again, you're sort of working across different levels of government as well. So, what is your experience been? I mean, even prior to COVID, but also during it. And what do you see as some of the, enabling factors to working within a state or working with the state?
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously a lot of every state is different, and I think assuming that a lot of context comes into play. But I think even beyond that, there are certain trends and patterns that you see in terms of like what works for large scale reform, right? Again, my this thing has always been to reform. The minute you talk reform, it needs to impact all children. Like otherwise, there's no point in doing that. So I think some of the things that we are seeing, at least from, I mean, Maharashtra, of course, I think we've been here for like 6, 7 years. Andhra, we just started working. We closely work with the World Bank. It's a hugely 5-year World Bank reform project that's happening in Andhra Pradesh. And Tripura and Haryana. Tripura is much smaller state, very different again in the northeast. But I think some trends and patterns that you see across these demographies that actually true for any context. I think one where there is a combination of a strong political and administrative will, and this is a very, I mean, might sound cliched, but I think that is true. No matter how much you say that, this is a great idea and this is going to change the landscape, we have worked with some research organizations who did RCT and showed us this is what, it doesn't work that way. India, education is not a technical problem, it's a socio-political issue. Till the time we do not get the politicians, the administrators on board to any reform agenda, it's not going to work. So I think those states where we are seeing a lot of political will, Andhra is a great example. Of course, we've heard about the work that they're doing. Kerala is another example. Andhra now, I think, has picked up a lot, I think, in terms of what they're doing. And then, right from a CM directive to say this is what needs to be done. And education, no other, I mean, it's very, very clear what needs to be done. So I think like that strong administrative and political will combination is deadly for any sort of sustainable impact. The second piece of it is the reform agenda has to be clear. It has to be absolutely clear right from the highest levels of public office to the lowest levels of people who are supporting teachers and school systems. It cannot be vague if it is learning improvement. And we have seen this in Maharashtra, right? Like the previous government here was very clear that whatever you do, we need to be in top 3 in ASER. That's all that came in from the CM, and everyone sort of followed it. So when your reform agenda is much broader, when it's like a lot of things, it's hard to sustain. Then you becomes like a more of a khichdi to say that ye bhi karenge, wo bhi karenge. But it's like, look, like there's one learning agenda we have, what is the change that we want to get. So I feel like that is, so open reform agendas are a problem. And that's what we have seen. The more targeted they are, the more specific, the more few, like say 1, 2, like if you say, what infrastructure is here, we're going to move here, learning is here, we're going to move here. Just that in itself makes a lot of difference. So I think that's the second piece of it, just clarity in the reform agenda. And the third piece of it is, of course, just a few champions. You need champions who will sort of navigate all the uncertainty of plans, the unions, managing people, all of this requires a few champions within the system. So I think like where states where you have a couple of really good champions, either politically or administratively, I think states that are able to sort of, at least for the initial kickoff, you need strong champions within the system. So I think these three broadly, I feel are some, enabling conditions.
Right. And in terms of how these specific states that you were working in kind of fared during COVID, and again, sort of coming back to that question of, out of school children specifically, one is, I mean, we of course all understood that in the initial days, especially of the pandemic, when we didn't know what was going on, like you said, there was some pivoting in terms of saying, we will maybe focus on some of the more urgent relief needs, right, of children. So nutrition and health and everything became prominent. And then even once we said, okay, now education needs to take focus again, there were a bunch of things that were sort of happening. So, I mean, one of my questions is sort of where did this question of out of school children fare in terms of priority order? or at what point of time did it kind of come back into, the agenda of the state in some sense? And then what were the kind of constraints that these states were facing? Like how did they sort of differ when it comes to this particular question of trying to bring children back to school?
Yeah, I mean, the technically the aspect of out of school children, as you said, existed even before COVID,
Yeah.
right? It was not a new issue. After COVID, everyone was out of school. So technically, there were no schools. Schools were shut down, so everyone was out of school. But I think it started off when after the second wave, I think later part of 2021 is when the schools started slowly opening up. November 21, they started slowly opening up. And I think that's when people thought, look, now I think it's a reset time, right? Like literally like everyone's out of school. The schools weren't there. So whoever is there is out. How do you sort of bring in people back into school? I think a lot of it was also driven by these low-income private school segment, because I think a significant chunk got shut down during COVID because of
Yeah.
the kind of low maintenance. Yeah, the viability is also very weak for these guys, right? Like the finance. So I think many shut down, and I think because of which I think there was a de facto children went out of school. I think later part of 2021 is when a lot of efforts happened, right? I think, but I think it is also the realization of the parents. I feel they started that we need to send children back. It's been 1.5 years. It might be because even parents were also tired that we can't take care of the children at home. But I think whatever happened, and I think I think I don't know if there was any sick, quite honestly. Like I've never seen a state which did this massive campaign about like bringing back children into school. No one quite honestly did that. Like I think there were decent efforts. There were some messages here and there, by the political class or anyone. But I think no state that I know of at least did any massive campaign. It organically happened, and I think which is a 40 years back, if you had said that India, whether they would have done it if COVID happened 40 years back, I don't know. But I
Right.
think how it happened, which I think is a great thing, because parents also saw that, the importance of education and all of that. So I think post 2021 to 22, it didn't happen overnight, right? It took a good 6-7 months till this academic year, which is June, July 2022. At 6 to 8 months it took for children to be able to come back to school, and whatever, wherever. And I think, I mean, I'm glad now that I can share, because yesterday the ASR results came in. The numbers have not drastically shifted. If you see the out of school children numbers right from 20, they've been tracking, right?
Yeah.
For ASR results are saying, but I mean, we trust that data in a more way, and there's the part of the policy conversations.
Yeah.
You see, there's no significant trip of out of school. What has happened is the children who left the private school, there's been a huge influx into the government. That has happened. Now, I think how do you retain them inside these government school systems is a larger question that all of us have. But I think historically, if you see the problem of out of school, also, I look at it in a different way, because it's 95 or almost across the state. If you see, there's 95% on an average are inside school, at least what they claim. And even ASR as a third party has also claimed it. Now, the problem with that 5 to 8% majority, even in Maharashtra, because I think we were studying this very, very closely 5-6 years ago, early belongs to the migratory communities, many in the conflict sort of areas, children in urban areas where there's a lot of movement because of specific work. I think, and there are certain particular categories. Even if you see, like in Maharashtra, there's bricklayer workers, right, who move entire course, and then there are these communities who basically go along with the migratory birds. Wherever the birds are, the entire family sort of moves. Now, that has historically been a problem, and there's no, I mean, I don't know, I mean, we thought about a lot of things, season loss, etc., but I think it just doesn't work anywhere, and I haven't seen any great solution for that. So I feel like that those are the category of people who belong to that 2 to 3%. So there's nothing that anyone can do, or I don't know if anyone has done anything around that, who always, so anything beyond that, anything more than 5%, 7% is where the alarm bells should ring. So I feel like, because we always look at that 100% mark and want every child in school, but I think this last 2-3% is a problem. But out of school was a critical issue. I think there was a huge cry and fear of dropout. But here's my thing about it. Numbers speak. They can also lie. June 2023 is when I'm thinking that there has to be consolidation. Many states are considering a consolidation of right from your population figures to actually coming into school, because being on the muster doesn't mean that the child is in school.
Yes.
Till the time that data doesn't come out, I think we can be happy about some of these numbers that the kids have come back and government enrollment is good. But I still fear, and this is deep down, and I hope I'm wrong, that there are huge number of children who've been left behind due to COVID.
When we talk about the sort of, one is enrollment in schools, and then that's what we record. And then absenteeism is a whole other piece when it comes to measuring sort of out of school children, right? And that is something that, again, I think different states kind of look at a little bit differently. So some say, if a child is not in school for 45 days at a time, some say a much smaller amount of like about 20 days or 15 days even is when they sort of try to track these children and things like that. But I think that was one of the issues that we saw with the evidence that came out during COVID, which was sort of that specifically, say, for example, a child with a disability or a migrant child who couldn't access online education or where it wasn't fully accessible to them, you saw a lot of absenteeism, right? That was happening. And it was something that I don't think because we haven't dealt with edtech, maybe when it comes to actually measuring out of school children, I think this is the first time that we've had to sort of consider needing to measure out of school children also through the lens of something like edtech, right? On like not physical schools. So given this, bunch of different points I'm trying to put together here, but when you're talking about these, trying to bring together this consolidated number or a more clear estimate, I think one thing that we also struggle with as a country is that we don't know, or we don't have a sort of standardized way of estimating out of school children, right? Because the way in which we track it differs. Who we miss out on, I think we know largely that these are the groups we usually miss out, so including migrant children. But then how to sort of fix that is something that we haven't figured out. So again, when it comes to, I don't know if this is something that you've, worked with in some sense, but have you sort of seen how states try to address this? And is that something where there is need for maybe, I don't know, like someone to sort of, figure out how this needs to be measured, or to come up with a standardized way to say, this is how we need to consolidate these numbers. At least for, one moment we can have a clear picture and then move on from there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think so many states do struggle. And that's what I'm saying. I think that's the thing about data, right? Like it's so hard to sort of, to your point around Pratham's results also,
Yeah.
data collection happened last year. They just launched the result this year. So by 2022, even if they started off the survey in like Feb, March, April, June, whatever, migration might have happened even during mid-year, kids might have moved back. So June 2023 is when the real consolidation should happen. And I think the numbers should come in. But the thing about out of school children and the way we're going to collect the data, I think it's completely, again, very few states are doing it. Only the smaller states have been able to do it to a certain extent, because I think the geography is very limited and it's easier to sort of do. Even if you get a third party, you can outsource it and say that, you know what, I think, why don't you do a survey? But bigger states, it's still hard. There is no standardized process. There's no standardized metric on when you say out of school. The continuum, and there are no, I think the larger question is also, this is 2023, and with Aadhaar and a lot of the technology integrations, India, we should be able to figure out this whole mapping of from a child being born to like he or she getting employment. I think it should all be tracked into one single sort of a unique ID system, which unfortunately no one has been able to do, because your Anganwadis, Asha workers are in place. It's not like there's that machinery. There's school education, then there's higher education. None of them speak to each other.
Yeah.
I think that's the big problem. And without those kind of mechanisms, it's hard to even, because on what basis are we saying a child is out of school? There's one question around that, right? Like there are certain states define it as, oh, if the child doesn't come on the, to a particular school, if he or she is enrolled, but they don't come for like 6 months at a stretch, then they are considered out of school. Now, Maharashtra defines it that way. Some other states might define it. So there's no common definition of what we are saying as out of school. Second piece of it is also, how do we know how many are out of school when is there a mechanism to map that these many children were born in that particular village, and how you sort of mapping it? How is one child, whether he or she is stacked onto one village? Because earlier back, 30-40 years back, it was all easy, right? Because the village, see in the village, it is no more true. The minute someone is born, you might get out of the village and for work or something. So till the time those issues are there, there's no sort of a, by the minute someone is born, is there a mechanism to track that child? There is unfortunately none. Till the time that root cause isn't solved, no matter how many surveys we're going to do, it is still going to be necessary. I mean, I have a slightly myopic view in this thing, but I think that's the way I look at it, because it's a problem of really inter-department sitting together and brainstorming at how can we sort of track. If you can track the number of scooters and cars in India, and cows in some states, I don't know why we can't figure out human beings, right? So I think like it's bizarre to even think that we talk about this. So I feel like the foundation problem is there. It is not a problem of a policy or statisticians who will come in and,
Yeah.
not a problem. I think even sitting here, we can work out the math and say that estimated itna numbers rahega, but that's not going to be helpful. So,
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. Okay. So, I guess my sort of next question, coming back to the idea of, strengthening state capacity, right? And maybe um, where the state sort of requires resources and capacity to be able to address this question. So what do you think the state should prioritize when it comes to this question of out of school children, or maybe even in education more broadly? Maybe you don't think that the problem of out of school children, like you said, right, if we're sort of getting numbers around that 95% mark, maybe that's not the most urgent problem now in terms of recovery. So where do you think the state should be sort of prioritizing efforts of recovery, and what kind of capacity do you think they need to be able to do that?
I think it's just data. Yeah. If you ask me, if you just one single piece that needs to be fixed in at least large states, it's just the way data is being managed, the ability for the states, the middle management to be able to look at data and make sensible decisions is where the real capacity gap is. I think at one level, like the MIS systems or the data capturing mechanisms to do this is weak. So I think one has to fix that governance piece when it comes to children, integration of across birth to sort of, cradle to career spectrum, what they call, right? Like, I think that spectrum needs to be clear when it comes to data. That's one, is there a mechanism to sort of where systems are talking to each other? And the second, once those mechanisms are in place, the ability to be able to sort of look at that data and make simple, sensible decisions. I think
Right.
at the core of it, I think, are the big issues right now. I mean, look at even the banking system, how much we have moved further, like the health system, like COVID app was a great example, like the way
Yeah.
people did it. Like, it's not like everyone was so tech savvy. People struggled, many rural people struggled, but we still were able to do it. And I just don't understand why we can't do it in such a big human indicator system. Yeah. Anyway, I think that's but that I feel is the single most thing. Simple systems that are able to sort of drive. Again, if your goal of reform agenda is very clear, people who are decision makers at that level need to know. Even if you see the way adoption systems like the CARA adoption system were left and abandoned, and that has been streamlined very nicely. It's of course very laborious to adopt a child right now in India, but the way they've been able to do nutrition, poshan ahar, right? Like that again is a very great example. So I think we just need to figure out and sit like what are some of those two or three pieces that will help the decision makers at a block, cluster, and a district level to be able to make the decisions. I think
Right.
if one people, of course, there are many things. I'm just oversimplifying it. But if I had to place, if I had 100 rupees, I would place like 95 on that. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
That's quite a strong,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so given everything that you just said, what is LFE's sort of focus with respect to education and sort of well-being, currently, but also in the sort of near future?
Yeah. So a few months back, or not a few months, I think it's been more than a year now. I think we did this research study with Brookings. So Brookings Center for Universal Education. So we were the research partners in India, where we did, they released this playbook of family engagement for child development. So we worked with Rebecca and team, and it was just a wonderful experience for us. I think just the way we are looking at parental engagement in education, not just again literacy, numeracy, but I think just the overall development of child.
Yeah.
right from your birth to like 8 years, which is a foundational stage, I think will be a key focus for us to understand. Like not that we are going to directly work with parents. That we are never going to do that. I think for us, our strength is working with the governments to be able to bring this into focus, lobby for such kind of policies, so which family engagement into being. But I think that's been a sort of a big area, and I think that will continue as an area for us. Um, Second thing when it comes to education is also just there's this what we call as teacher's time on task. I think like what is the amount of time that the teacher is spending inside the classroom for what activities and classroom transactions is something that we need to sort of push. We always talk a lot about great curriculum, great TLM. Fine, I mean not that they're not important, they're very critical. A lot of work has already gone in. We know what is the best way to deliver pedagogy, but I still feel that the time we do not measure and map teachers' time on task, I think it's going to be hard. So within a classroom, even if I say, oh, that fine, the teacher has been there, the teacher being present in itself is problem for some states. But I'm saying teachers inside the classroom, what is the teacher doing at what time? So I think for that also we're working with the World Bank, and they have this research-based tool called the Teach tool, which now we are sort of trying to which maps really irrespective of what language or whatever you're teaching, this tool really measures the classroom transactions that happen. And then so we are trying to sort of now roll it out across the state of Andhra Pradesh, and we're helping a couple more states to do that as a part of this. So that's another, again, data coming in. But I think really the question about data is also what is that you're measuring? So the time on task, and how do you sort of improve it? So that's a second thing in terms of our focus of all the things that we are sort of doing. Socio-emotional well-being, again, the SEL is a big thing. Not that, again, we are going to do it or anything, but this we have now clubbed it as how do you make it a part of the Nipun Bharat. Nipun Bharat talks about social emotional learning apart from literacy and numeracy. So, like, how do you sort of make social emotional well-being integrated rather than being a separate thing? Because I know many states have done it as like another curriculum, as another thing. That most of the times doesn't work until unless it's highly controlled in like a 1,000-2,000 school network. But when you're talking about the 60,000-70,000 school networks of states, it is hard. Teachers will always see it as another thing that they're teaching, right? I mean, I've been a teacher. If someone asked me, ki, bhai, ye curriculum padha do, I would have been like, yeah, you're taking away my time from something. So that, how do you sort of then integrate SCL, make it a priority along with the Nipun Bharat, is the third big priority that we are sort of seeing when it comes to just sort of education and well-being of children. And the last piece of it is just, and we constantly sort of push this in our work, is just strengthening teacher development and support in a more decentralized way. If we know the last point of delivery is teacher, no matter how many tech tools you bring in, you cannot replace a teacher. So how do you then make teacher, how do you support teachers? Because the way systems, and this is what we have learned, is that it's not linear. If there is anything linear, it is that we always say, oh, the teachers are not treating the children well, but it is a reflection of how the system is treating a teacher. So system continuously curses teachers. They they don't encourage them. They just keep discouraging them. They do all sorts of things with the teachers which are not conducive. The teacher is going to treat the children the same way, and it's a direct reflection. But to support a teacher, it's a lot more complicated. So I think like till the time it's decentralized and localized, insert teacher development, support, and mentoring, your innovations at a school and a classroom levels cannot excel. So I think like these are the four sort of key pieces that we are, when we are looking at a systems change lens, that we feel that will be good for us to learn. Not that we have answers for everything, but I think we are also learning on the way.
Right. So I mean, this piece on parental engagement, I think something that I sort of missed asking you about altogether, but during COVID again, especially, I think not that we didn't already know that this is a very important piece, especially from even an equity standpoint, right? There's enough evidence to sort of point to parents needing to be sort of supported to be able to support their children as well and their education. And I think COVID really became like an eye-opener in terms of how much we maybe have neglected that, especially with like maybe even in the early years, right? Because Anganwadis, I guess, do some sort of, or at least try to in their curriculum, do some sort of interaction with parents. And but that's something that we don't sort of do in a very structured way. A question about the sort of teachers' time on task thing. Does this also, coming from a sort of policy perspective, and recently I think Tamil Nadu sort of passed that, a new provision saying that, I think it was Tamil Nadu, I will cross-check that, but saying that teachers, Telangana was it? Andhra, oh, okay. Right, Andhra. That makes sense. Basically saying that, teachers won't be involved in sort of administrative work. Yeah, so I mean, that seems to be, such a simple thing, but almost revolutionary, right? Because for so long, I think there's, again, so much evidence on how much time gets spent on these non-educational, not even ancillary to education kind of tasks. So was that something LFE was involved in advocating for in Andhra?
I mean, we obviously are we are working for 1.5 years, but I think it was truly the champions within the system who saw that we completely endorsed it. When the idea came up that this is something that they had to do, we completely, we said, we in fact gave additional research to support, like,
Right.
that is what is going to be a game changer.
Right.
I think the resolution is passed, everything is there in paper. How it needs to be in action, I think will need to be seen in the days to come.
Yeah, no, for sure. Because as in they were sort of citing who would probably take on those tasks, but we know how many roles teachers play in the current system, right? So yeah, it will be interesting to see, but I hope it's sort of precedence for what other states can also do to sort of relieve teachers of yeah, because I remember I mean, from when I first started sort of working in the education sector, I was working with like teachers. We were doing sort of interviews, and I remember they like a bunch of teachers canceled interviews on one day that we had set up. And when we sort of asked them why, I mean, we just assumed they were, busy, and that's fair. But it was because they were called to some sort of event that a politician was holding, and there wasn't enough of a crowd, and they were being called to sort of put on shirts and make it seem like there was a crowd for the media. And I think that was just the most egregious version of this that I had ever experienced, and still, like, sort of sits with me. And similarly, I think sometimes some foreign prime minister was visiting a city, and then, you had teachers sort of lining the roads to cheer for them and things like that. And it was just like, yeah, like I think the most upsetting version of administrative work sort of taking up their time. But okay, so when you, sorry, my question was, when you're talking about sort of time on task, this is an aspect of it as well?
Absolutely. I think reducing the administrative workload, I think a lot of it is, again, going back to MIS, right? Every time, like, why do you need how many kids, how many female, male children, how many minority, SC, Muslim, etc.? It has to be available. It's 2023, one click, everyone should know that, you don't need to keep asking for that data.
Yeah.
Redundant data takes up a good 30% of teachers' time. And there's a lot of studies that are there. Every time, like, har mahine, why do you need, right? I mean, it's not like every day a new child is joining. Fine, there are some that might be once in 6 months, this data might change. But I think to be asking all of this information again and again is where the teachers. What also happens is many of these officers who are just on top of a teachers are not tech savvy. They generally become officers later age. So they then pull in some teachers who are young and smart with using Excel sheets and all of that to get So all of these things just take time. And I'm always like, you build a tool as simple as a WhatsApp. That's how such simple tools need to be. WhatsApp kisne, there's no one who taught WhatsApp to all of these old officers. Even for our grandparents, even if you see our families, parents and grandparents, they learned it on their own. No one taught you to use something. So I think like those are some things that I think need to be looked at there, because there's a lot of human element in how this reform needs to happen. It just purely cannot be technical. So I think how do you integrate some of those human elements of change, behavioral change, and bring about is where the real challenge is.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, so I'm just gonna sort of maybe conclude this conversation with one question that I hope is more sort of reflective for us, as in for me, and our team over here. But so during COVID-19 again, we did see a lot of organizations were able to sort of do work that was maybe more responsive. You spoke about doing a sort of dipstick survey and then meeting some of those needs that kind of arose through that, right? Through those conversations. But you've been in this sector for a long time. You maybe have an idea of what a lot of the other organizations were doing as well. As sort of researchers, practitioners, who've been in this sector, we're passionate about education. Where do you think we sort of dropped the ball during COVID, right? Given that it was all like, what could we have done better? Maybe better way of phrasing it. But, given that we all wanted to help, we of course were in a position where we all felt very helpless, I'm sure. But yeah, what do you think our role sort of is in a situation like this, or should be rather?
I mean, if you want a response on the past, I really don't think there's anything anyone could have done. This was a moment in the history of the world where unprecedented, and no one expected that there's going to be something like this where so everyone was helpless. We were all running around like headless chickens, at least in our own homes, trying to figure out what we could have done in our own locus of control. But if you ask me, in hindsight, also, I always think about this. Is there? I mean, even as people running organizations and education organizations, there was a lot of this emotional pressure on us. At some point, I think it was survival was a key back in 2020, 21. It was a very hard period for many of us.
Yeah.
And when we think back on this question of really, could we have done anything different? My answer is nothing. No one could have done anything different. And I think if we are hard on ourselves, if we are asking that question, I think what would be a better question to say that after 1 year of wave 1, wave 2 of the COVID pandemic, is there anything we could have done better? Then my question is yes. I think a lot of the thought process was built during the first 3 to 4 months. We had clear indication of what would have happened. There was a lot of research and policy evidence, some of these crisis evidence from the past, how, especially during wars and all, what eventually happens. It was like situation like that. We could have better served the most underserved communities. And I think as a country, we could have done better. Let it be the migrant, let it be conflict areas, tribal children, more of those, people in those areas, children in those areas. I think some sort of a quick pivoting could have happened. And this is as a society. I don't think just as, as researchers or educators, but I think everyone had a limited voice. It was just mad everywhere. But I think that section who were most vulnerable, I think could have been protected, could have been safeguarded and catered to in a much better way. And I feel that is something that we might have dropped the ball after maybe 1-2 years after the pandemic. But I wouldn't say when pandemic hit, I don't think there's anything anyone could have done better.
Right. No. Fair enough. I think it's just one of those questions that, at least being sort of young in this space, I feel like I constantly sort of question what our role should be. And I mean, I guess that's a general question that happens, every Monday sort of. But then especially...
We are prepared now. Now we know if anything hits, we know now. Now you do not have a choice. If you say 2025 another pandemic is going to come, then we need to ask this question. Now we know what would happen. So I think it's like saying someone nuked India. We really don't know what because we are not there. That's what history is made. So
right. No, fair. But okay, so I think that sort of broadly, those are all the questions that I sort of had. Anything else you'd like to add, Madhukar, before I relieve you from this conversation?
No. I think wonderful conversation. I think because I think we're moving so fast, even post-pandemic, just to make sure that we are catching up on the last 2-3 years. I think in a while it's good to sort of look through and imagine what went on in 2020, 21. Because it was very different. I feel like we came from another world and just jumped into 2023. So I feel it's good to sort of take a step back and reflect on what were the thought process at that point in time. That meant, again, eventually all of this is for us to help us respond, not react, maybe respond better when hopefully not, God forbid, if we...
Yeah.
But thank you. Thanks, Nisha. I think wonderful conversation.
This podcast is produced by the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy under the Kotak-Karma Vidhi Inclusive Education Program. The Kotak-Karma Vidhi Inclusive Education Program is a CSR initiative by Kotak Mahindra Bank Ltd. This podcast is based and born from Vidhi's report, Clearing the Air, a synthesized mapping of out-of-school children during COVID-19 in India. This report is produced under funding received from Voltas Limited as part of their CSR initiative. Video design and editing by Asad Ali, illustration by Hitesh Sonar.